I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a high school history teacher in Boise, Idaho, and I thought that meant I was good at reading people. You spend 3 decades in the classroom, you learn to tell when someone's lying to you. You learn to see through the performance. At least, that's what I told myself. My first wife, Carol, died of ovarian cancer in the spring of 2021. We'd been married 38 years. I won't spend too long on that part because it's not really what this story is about, but you need to understand what that kind of loss does to a person. It doesn't just take someone away from you, it takes the version of yourself that existed alongside them. I didn't know how to grocery shop for one. I didn't know what to do on Sunday mornings. I wake up and reach across the bed and then remember. And that remembering happened every single day for 2 years. My daughter, Tessa, worried about me constantly. She lived 40 minutes away in Meridian with her husband and their 2 kids, and she'd call every evening just to make sure I was eating. She's like her mother in that way, practical, watchful. She notices things. I met Sandra at a community grief support group in the fall of 2022. She'd lost her husband, a man named Bob, to a heart attack 18 months earlier. She was warm and funny, and she had this quality I can only describe as steadiness. She made me feel like the ground was solid again. We started having coffee after the meetings, then dinners. By the following spring, we were spending most weekends together. I know what you're thinking. And my daughter thought the same thing. "Dad," Tessa said to me one evening when I told her Sandra and I were getting serious, "you've only known her for 7 months." I told her grief does funny things to timelines, that when you've already lived a full life and you know what a good partnership feels like, you don't need years to recognize it again. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Just be careful, okay? I'm not saying anything is wrong. I just want you to be careful." I hugged her and told her I would be. I wasn't. Sandra and I got married in October of 2023, a small ceremony at the courthouse with a dinner afterward at a steakhouse in downtown Boise. Tessa came. She smiled all evening and hugged Sandra and said all the right things. But later, when we were standing by my car in the parking lot, she looked at me with this expression I'd seen on her face when she was 12 years old and didn't want to tell me something that would upset me. "I like her, Dad," she said. "I do. I just hope you're right about her." I was 63. I had a pension, a paid-off house on the north end of Boise, a modest retirement account, and a life insurance policy. I wasn't wealthy by any measure, but I was comfortable. I'd worked for it steadily over 3 decades, and I was proud of it. Sandra moved in 2 weeks after we married. She had a 1-bedroom apartment in Garden City that she'd been renting since Bob died. She said she'd let the lease lapse because she didn't see the point in holding on to it. I thought that was sensible. Now I think about it differently. The first thing I noticed, and I want to be honest about this because I dismissed it at the time, was how many small accidents she had. In the first 4 months of our marriage, Sandra fell down the back porch steps and bruised her hip badly. She slipped in the bathroom and hit her shoulder against the vanity. She reached for a box on the garage shelf and lost her balance, landing hard on her wrist. Each time it happened, I felt terrible. I suggested we put grip tape on the stairs, buy a shower mat, move things to lower shelves. I blamed the house. I blamed myself for not thinking of safety sooner. She'd wave her hand and say she'd always been clumsy, that she was fine, that I worried too much. The wrist one bothered her for weeks. I offered to take her to urgent care, but she said she'd already been. She showed me the paperwork. A hairline fracture, she said. Nothing to do but rest it. I didn't think to ask which urgent care. I didn't think to check. When I look back at those months now, I can see myself the way you can see a figure in a photograph standing at the edge of a cliff, completely unaware of the drop. I was so focused on being a good husband, on being present, on being attentive, that I was looking in entirely the wrong direction. In February of 2024, Sandra said she hadn't seen a dentist since before Bob died, and she should probably get a cleaning and some updated x-rays. She asked if I could come with her because she'd always been anxious about dental work. I said, of course. We went to a practice over on Eagle Road that she'd looked up online. A new dentist, not one either of us had a history with. The hygienist took Sandra back for her cleaning and x-rays while I sat in the waiting room with a magazine I wasn't really reading. I remember the magazines were all 6 months old. There was a space heater in the corner making a faint clicking sound. I'd been there maybe 40 minutes when a woman in a white coat came out to the waiting room and asked if I was Sandra's husband. I said I was. She introduced herself as Dr. Budd Ellison and asked if I'd mind stepping into her office for a moment. Something in her voice made me set the magazine down very carefully on the chair beside me. She closed the office door. She didn't sit behind her desk. She stood near the window with her arms crossed loosely in front of her, and she looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as professionally careful. "I want to ask you a few questions," she said, "and I want you to understand that I'm asking them out of concern for your wife's well-being." I told her to go ahead. "When we take dental x-rays," she said, "we capture more than just the teeth. Depending on the type of imaging, we get a fairly clear picture of the surrounding bone structure, the jaw, the lower skull, portions of the facial skeleton." She paused. "In Sandra's x-rays, I'm seeing healed fractures in multiple locations. Not fresh injuries, old ones. At least 4 that I can identify. Possibly more." I didn't say anything right away. I was trying to understand what she was telling me. "Is your wife in any kind of situation at home where she might be experiencing?" She stopped herself, chose different words. "Has Sandra mentioned any accidents to you? Falls, impacts of any kind?" I said yes. "Several, actually, since we'd been married. 4 months. Dr. Ellison looked at me for a moment. 4 months, she repeated. "We got married in October," I said. She uncrossed her arms. She walked slowly to her desk and picked up the phone. She said, "I need to make a call. I'd like you to stay here if you don't mind." I found out later she called a social worker she'd worked with before, a mandatory reporter. She was obligated to flag what she'd found, but she wanted to make sure the call went to the right person. She wasn't calling the police, not yet. She was calling someone who could help her understand what she was looking at. While she made that call, I sat in the chair across from her empty desk and tried to arrange my thoughts into something that made sense. Sandra said she'd always been clumsy. 4 fractures, possibly more, 4 months of marriage. I thought about Bob, her first husband. I thought about the 18 months she'd been a widow before I met her. I thought about how she described his death. Sudden, unexpected, devastating. A heart attack at 61 in a man who'd never shown symptoms. I don't know when that thought arrived exactly. I just know that it arrived, and once it did, I couldn't make it leave. Dr. Ellison came back into the office and said she'd like to speak with Sandra separately before we left. She asked if I'd be willing to wait. I said I would. She looked at me the way people look at someone they feel sorry for, and are trying not to show it. I went back to the waiting room. The space heater was still clicking. The magazines were still 6 months old. Sandra came out about 20 minutes later. Her expression was composed, but I'd been married to her for 4 months, and I'd been a teacher for 31 years, and I knew the difference between calm and controlled. That was controlled. In the car, she said Dr. Ellison was overly cautious and had been a bit insulting, honestly, being asked all those questions about her home life. She said the old fractures were from years ago, from before Bob died, from a car accident she'd never mentioned to me because it wasn't relevant. She said she was fine and she'd probably find a different dentist. I told her that made sense. I did not tell her that I'd already decided, sitting in that waiting room, to call my daughter. Tessa answered on the second ring. I was in my truck in the driveway of our house. Sandra already inside. I told Tessa everything Dr. Ellison had said. I heard my daughter get very quiet in that particular way she does when she's thinking hard and doesn't want to say the wrong thing. "Dad," she finally said, "I want to look something up. Can you give me a couple of days?" I asked her what she was looking for. "I'm not sure yet," she said. "I just want to check a few things. Don't tell Sandra I called." "You didn't call," I said. "I called you." "Right," she said. "Don't tell her that either." Those next 2 days were the strangest of my life. I made dinner. I watched television with Sandra on the couch. I listened to her talk about a book she was reading and the weather and a neighbor she'd met at the mailbox. I was present in the way a prop is present. I was there, but nothing I did was real. On the third day, Tessa came over while Sandra was at a yoga class. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with her laptop and a printed page she'd folded in half, and she looked like she didn't want to be right about whatever she'd found. She'd pulled insurance records. She knew a woman at her husband's firm who did estate work and knew how to navigate certain databases, and together they'd found something. Sandra had filed 4 insurance claims in the 3 years before Bob died. All of them listed Sandra herself as the injured party. One for a broken collarbone, one for a fractured rib, one for a rest injury, one for a wrist injury, one for a concussion following what was described as a fall at home. The payouts were modest, between $4,000 and $9,000 each, but they were there. She was making claims before Bob died, Tessa said. She'd been doing it for years. I asked about Bob's life insurance. Tessa turned the folded page over. Bob had carried a $400,000 term life policy. Sandra was the sole beneficiary. It had paid out in full 11 months after his death, once the contestability period cleared. I sat with that number for a long time. "There's one more thing," Tessa said. She didn't want to tell me. I could see it. She'd found a record of a prescription filled at a pharmacy in Garden City at Sandra's address 3 months before Bob died. It was for a medication used primarily in palliative care, in doses calibrated for pain management in terminal patients. Bob had not been terminally ill. His death certificate listed cause of death as cardiac arrest. I'm not a doctor. I'm a retired history teacher from Boise, but I've spent a lifetime teaching students to ask what the evidence suggests, not what we wish it meant. And the evidence in front of me was very clear. I didn't confront Sandra. I want to be honest about that. My first instinct was to walk back into the house and demand an explanation, and Tessa talked me out of it. She sat there at my kitchen table and she said, "Dad, if she's done what I think she's done, the worst thing you can do is let her know you need to call someone first." I called the lawyer that afternoon. The lawyer called the contact at the Ada County Sheriff's Office. And then, because I am a man who had been married to someone for 4 months and was sitting in the lawyer's office trying to understand how this had become my life, I went very quiet for a long time and just listened to other people talk. What happened next took several weeks to unfold, and I'll condense it because the legal details are less important than what they revealed. A detective made contact with the pharmacy in Garden City. Sandra's prescription history was subpoenaed. A forensic review of Bob's medical records, cross-referenced with the prescription timeline, was requested through the county medical examiner's office. The findings were turned over to the county attorney. I won't tell you exactly what those findings were, because the case is still pending as of when I'm telling you this story. What I will tell you is that Sandra was arrested in March of 2024 at our house while I was staying at Tessa's. The charge included insurance fraud. There was a second charge I won't name here, but it involved Bob's death and a phrase the detective used when he called me, "suspicious circumstances warranting further investigation." The morning after Sandra's arrest, I sat in Tessa's guest room and looked out the window at her backyard. Her kids were asleep. The sun was just coming up over the Boise foothills, turning everything that pale orange color that only happens in early spring out here. There was a robin on the fence post, just sitting there, not doing anything in particular. I thought about Carol. I thought about how she'd spent the last year of her life being so careful with her words, not wanting to leave me more grief than she had to. I thought about how she'd told me 2 weeks before she died that she hoped I'd find someone eventually, that I was too good at loving people to spend the rest of my life alone. I think she'd have been furious on my behalf, and I think she'd have been proud of Tessa. I moved out of the Evil Road house in April. I'm renting a small place near the river now, over in the north end, not far from where Tessa grew up. I walk along the greenbelt most mornings. I've gone back to reading, real reading, not just pages I pretend to turn. I had lunch with a colleague from my teaching years last month and laughed at something for the first time in a while, and I noticed it, the way you notice a feeling you'd forgotten you were capable of. I'm not going to tell you I'm fine because that's not quite true yet. I'm in the process of becoming fine, which is a different and slower thing. There are nights when I lie awake and trace the timeline backward and try to find the moment I could have seen it, the thing I missed, the question I should have asked. But a therapist I've been seeing since April reminded me that people like Sandra are not careless. They don't leave obvious threads. They choose people who are good at trusting because that's the necessary condition for what they do. She chose me because I was grieving and kind, and I wanted to believe the best of her. Those aren't flaws. I have to keep reminding myself of that. Tessa called me last Sunday just to talk. Not to check on me, just to talk. We spoke for an hour about her kids and a documentary she'd watched, and a student I'd had 30 years ago who'd apparently become a state senator. Ordinary things. The kind of conversation that makes a Sunday feel like something. Before she hung up, she said, "I'm glad you called me, Dad, when you were in the parking lot." I told her I was glad, too. I've thought a lot about Dr. Ellison since all of this happened. She didn't have to do what she did. She could have filed a routine referral and moved on to her next patient. Instead, she stopped. She looked at the picture in front of her and she refused to explain it away. She made a phone call. She sat with me in her office and asked careful questions and took the time to make sure the right person heard what she'd found. I sent her a card a few weeks after the arrest. I didn't know what to say, so I kept it short. I told her that she probably saved my life and that I was grateful. She sent a note back. It said, "I just did my job. I'm glad it helped." I've kept that note in the drawer of my nightstand. Some nights it's the last thing I read before I turn off the lamp. I'm 64 years old, and I live alone by a river in Idaho, and I am, slowly and imperfectly, learning how to trust the world again. Not blindly. Not the way I did before, but enough. Some days that feels like enough. I've had a lot of time to think about cause and effect since all this happened, not in any mystical sense. I'm a history teacher. I deal in evidence and consequence, but in the plain, mechanical way that one choice leads to another, and eventually you end up somewhere you never expected to be standing. Sandra made choices for years, long before she met me. She learned at some point that the world would give her things if she was willing to hurt herself to collect them. And then she learned something worse, that she didn't always have to be the one who got hurt. Every one of those choices had a consequence she didn't see coming or chose not to see. The prescription she filled in Garden City, the insurance claim she filed, Bob's death, and then me, a grieving man who wanted to believe in something good again. Every step she took toward that outcome was a step she chose. The ending was always embedded in the beginning. I think about that when I'm tempted to ask myself how I missed it. Because the honest answer is that I was not looking for it. I was 63 years old and I had just spent 2 years learning how to exist after losing the person I'd built my entire adult life alongside. I wanted to trust because trusting felt like proof that I was still capable of it. That's not stupidity. That's what it means to be a person who has loved someone and survived losing them. Sandra understood that. She counted on it. What I've come to believe, not from a book, just from sitting with it long enough, is that intelligence without honesty eventually collapses under its own weight. Sandra was smart. She was careful. She had constructed something that looked, from every angle I was standing at, like a real life. But it had no true foundation because nothing about it was real. And things without foundations always fall. Maybe not today, maybe not for years, but they fall. Dr. Ellison looked at an X-ray that Sandra had looked at 100 times in her own mirror, and saw exactly what it was. One person asking an honest question undid years of careful construction. And Tessa. My daughter sat across from me at my kitchen table and told me something she knew would break my heart, because she loved me more than she loved my comfort. That's what real courage looks like, not the dramatic kind, the quiet, steady kind that says, "I would rather hurt you now than watch you be destroyed later." She didn't enjoy being right. I could see that on her face, but she didn't let that stop her from telling me the truth, and that made all the difference. I'm not the same person I was before October of 2023. I'm more careful now. I ask more questions. I pay attention to the things people do rather than just what they say. But I want to be clear about something because I think it matters. I am not more closed. I am not less willing to trust. What I am is more honest with myself about what I'm seeing. There's a difference between wisdom and walls. Wisdom lets you move through the world with your eyes open. Walls just keep you in the dark alone. I'm 64 years old and I walk along the river most mornings, and I'm still here. That's not nothing. That's everything.